There was also a little group of 3 or 4 young men with lantern jaws and thick eyebrows, who were conversing in one corner, but they seemed to be of secondary importance, and laughed and talked together without attracting any attention. The ladies were gathered in a little knot by themselves round the rickety table before mentioned. There was Miss Snevellicci, who could do anything from a medley dance to Lady Macbeth, and also always played some part in blue silk knee-smalls at her benefit, glancing from the depths of her coal-scuttled straw bonnet at Nicholas, and affecting to be absorbed in the recital of a diverting story to her friend Miss Ledrook, who had brought her work, and was making up a ruff in the most natural manner possible. There was Miss Belvawney, who seldom aspired to speaking parts, and usually went on as a page in white silk hose, to stand with one leg bent and contemplate the audience, or to go in and out after Mr. Crummles in stately tragedy, twisting up the ringlets of the beautiful Miss Bravassa, who had once had her likeness taken in character by an engraver's apprentice, whereof impressions were hung up for sale in the pastrycook's window, and the greengrocer's, and at the circulating library, and the box office, whenever the announce bills came out for her annual night. There was Mrs. Lenville, in a very limp bonnet and veil, decidedly in that way in which she would wish to be if she truly loved Mr. Lenville. There was Miss Gazingi, with an imitation ermine boa tied in a loose knot round her neck, flogging Mr. Crummles, junior, with both ends in fun. Lastly, there was Mrs. Grudden, in a brown cloth pelisse and a beaver bonnet, who assisted Mrs. Crummles in her domestic affairs, and took money at the doors, and dressed the ladies, and swept the house, and kept the prompt book when everybody else was on for the last scene, and acted any kind of part on any emergency without ever learning it, and was put down in the bills under any name or names whatever that occurred to Mr. Crummles as looking well in print. Mr. Folair, having obligingly confided these particulars to Nicholas, left him to mingle with his fellows. The work of personal introduction was completed by Mr. Vincent Crummles, who publicly heralded the new actor as a prodigy of genius and learning. "I beg your pardon," said Miss Snevellicci, sidling towards Nicholas, "but did you ever play at Canterbury?" "I never did," replied Nicholas. "I recollect meeting a gentleman at Canterbury," said Miss Snevellicci, "only for a few moments, for I was leaving the company as he joined it, so like you that I felt almost certain it was the same." "I see you now for the first time," rejoined Nicholas, with all due gallantry. "I am sure I never saw you before. I couldn't have forgotten it." "Oh, I'm sure. It's very flattering of you to say so," retorted Miss Snevellicci, with a graceful bend. "Now I look at you again, I see that the gentleman at Canterbury hadn't the same eyes as you. You'll think me very foolish for taking notice of such things, won't you?" "Not at all," said Nicholas. "How can I feel otherwise than flattered by your notice in any way?" "Oh, you men are such vain creatures," said Miss Snevellicci. Whereupon she became charmingly confused, and pulling out her pocket-handkerchief from a faded pink silk reticule with a gilt clasp, called to Miss Ledrook. "Led, my dear," said Miss Snevellicci. "Well, what is the matter?" said Miss Ledrook. "It's not the same." "Not the same what?" "Canterbury. You know what I mean. Come here, I want to speak to you." But Miss Ledrook wouldn't come to Miss Snevellicci, so Miss Snevellicci was obliged to go to Miss Ledrook, which she did in a skipping manner that was quite fascinating, and Miss Ledrook evidently joked Miss Snevellicci about being struck with Nicholas, for after some playful whispering, Miss Snevellicci hit Miss Ledrook very hard on the backs of her hands, and retired up in a state of pleasing confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Mr. Vincent Crummles, who had been writing on a piece of paper, "we'll call the mortal struggle tomorrow at 10. Everybody for the procession. Intrigue and ways and means you're all up in, so we shall only want one rehearsal. Everybody at 10, if you please." "Everybody at 10," repeated Mrs. Grudden, looking about her. "On Monday morning we shall read a new piece," said Mr. Crummles. "The name's not known yet, but everybody will have a good part. Mr. Johnson will take care of that." "Hallo!" said Mr. Johnson, starting. "On Monday morning," repeated Mr. Crummles, raising his voice to drown the unfortunate Mr. Johnson's remonstrance. "That'll do, ladies and gentlemen." The ladies and gentlemen required no second notice to quit, and in a few minutes the theatre was deserted, save by the Crummles family, Nicholas, and Smike. "'Pon my word," said Nicholas, taking the manager aside, "I don't think I can be ready by Monday." "Pooh, pooh," replied Mr. Crummles. "But really I can't," returned Nicholas. "My invention is not accustomed to these demands, or possibly I might produce—" "Invention! What the devil's that got to do with it?" cried the manager hastily. "Everything, my dear sir." "Nothing, my dear sir," retorted the manager with evident impatience. "Do you understand French?" "Perfectly well." "Very good," said the manager, opening the table drawer, and giving a roll of paper from it to Nicholas. "There, just turn that into English, and put your name on the title page." "Damn me," said Mr. Crummles angrily, "if I haven't often said that I wouldn't have a man or woman in my company that wasn't master of the language, so that they might learn it from the original, and play it in English, and save all this trouble and expense." Nicholas smiled, and pocketed the play. "What are you going to do about your lodgings?" said Mr. Crummles. Nicholas could not help thinking that, for the first week, it would be an uncommon convenience to have a turn-up bedstead in the pit, but he merely remarked that he had not turned his thoughts that way. "Come home with me, then," said Mr. Crummles, "and my boys shall go with you after dinner, and show you the most likely place." The offer was not to be refused. Nicholas and Mr. Crummles gave Mrs. Crummles an arm each, and walked up the street in stately array. Smike, the boys, and the phenomenon went home by a shorter cut, and Mrs. Grudden remained behind to take some cold Irish stew and a pint of porter in the box office. Mrs. Crummles trod the pavement as if she were going to immediate execution with an animating consciousness of innocence, and that heroic fortitude which virtue alone inspires. Mr. Crummles, on the other hand, assumed the look and gait of a hardened despot, but they both attracted some notice from many of the passers-by, and when they heard a whisper of "Mr. and Mrs. Crummles," or saw a little boy run back to stare them in the face, the severe expression of their countenances relaxed, for they felt it was popularity. Mr. Crummles lived in St. Thomas's Street, at the house of one Bulph, a pilot, who sported a boat green door, with window frames of the same colour, and had the little finger of a drowned man on his parlour mantel-shelf, with other maritime and natural curiosities. He displayed also a brass knocker, a brass plate, and a brass bell handle, all very bright and shining, and had a mast with a vane on the top of it in his backyard. "You are welcome," said Mrs. Crummles, turning round to Nicholas when they reached the bow-windowed front room on the first floor. Nicholas bowed his acknowledgments, and was unfeignedly glad to see the cloth laid. "We have but a shoulder of mutton with onion sauce," said Mrs. Crummles, in the same charnel house voice, "but, such as our dinner is, we beg you to partake of it." "You are very good," replied Nicholas. "I shall do it ample justice." "Vincent," said Mrs. Crummles, "what is the hour?" 5 minutes past dinner time," said Mr. Crummles. Mrs. Crummles rang the bell. "Let the mutton and onion sauce appear." The slave who attended upon Mr. Bulph's lodgers disappeared, and after a short interval reappeared with the festive banquet. Nicholas and the infant phenomenon opposed each other at the Pembroke table, and Smike and the Master Crummleses dined on the sofa bedstead. "Are they very theatrical people here?" asked Nicholas. "No," replied Mr. Crummles, shaking his head. 'Far from it. Far.